For centuries, India's Jewish communities carried a question that no historian could fully answer. Were they descendants of Jewish travelers who crossed the Arabian Sea thousands of years ago? Or were they primarily Indian populations who later adopted Judaism? The answer seemed impossible to recover because the oldest records were incomplete, oral traditions had become mixed with legend, and the communities themselves had lived apart from the wider Jewish world for generations. Then scientists started looking at something that could not tell stories, could not preserve legends, and could not be persuaded by tradition: DNA. They compared the genomes of Indian Jewish communities with Jewish populations from the Middle East and Europe, and with dozens of Indian populations living around them. What they found was not one simple origin story. It was something much more powerful. The DNA revealed that Indian Jews were genuinely connected to the wider Jewish genetic world, but it also revealed that their communities had absorbed substantial Indian ancestry and followed different migration histories. Bene Israel, Cochin Jews, and other Indian Jewish communities did not come from one single migration. They were created through several waves of movement, intermarriage, isolation, and community formation across centuries. And one of the most surprising discoveries was that the strongest detectable Jewish admixture in Bene Israel appears to date to roughly the last millennium, while Cochin Jewish genomes preserve evidence of a significant Jewish gene flow event roughly 500 to 700 years ago. The science did not destroy the old stories. It forced researchers to make them much more complicated. And now, after centuries of debate, the DNA is beginning to reveal where Indian Jews really came from. The first mistake people make when discussing Indian Jewish ancestry is assuming there is one population called Indian Jews with one genetic history. There is not. India has been home to several distinct Jewish communities, each shaped by a different combination of migration, local ancestry, religious tradition, and endogamy. The Bene Israel became established mainly along the Konkan coast of western India and later in Mumbai. The Cochin Jews developed on the Malabar coast of Kerala. The Baghdadi Jews arrived much later through migration from Iraq, Syria, Iran, and surrounding parts of the Middle East, especially during the early modern and colonial periods. There are also smaller and more recent communities whose histories are very different again. Because these groups formed at different times, scientists cannot simply sequence one Indian Jewish population and apply the result to everyone. The genetic evidence shows precisely why that would be misleading. The Bene Israel resemble local Western Indian populations while still showing substantial Jewish ancestry. Cochin Jews also resemble local Indian populations, but their Jewish ancestry has a different structure and appears to include later contributions associated with Yemenite, Sephardi, and other Middle Eastern Jewish populations. This means the phrase, "Where did Indian Jews come from?" actually contains several questions. Where did the earliest Jewish ancestors arrive from? When did they arrive? How much local Indian ancestry entered the community? How many later Jewish migrants joined them? And how much of that ancestry survived after centuries of endogamy? Modern population genetics can answer some of these questions, but not all of them, and the answers differ from one Indian Jewish community to another. The Bene Israel story is perhaps the most dramatic because their traditional history describes a group of Jewish ancestors surviving a shipwreck on the western coast of India and eventually forming a small community. According to oral traditions, these survivors preserved fragments of Jewish practice while adapting to Indian society. They became Marathi-speaking, developed local customs, and lived for long periods with limited contact with other Jewish communities. Historians have never been able to establish the exact date of the original migration with certainty. Traditional estimates have ranged from ancient periods before the Common Era to later centuries. This uncertainty made genetics especially valuable. Researchers collected genome-wide data from 18 Bene Israel individuals and compared them with hundreds of individuals from Jewish, Indian, Pakistani, and worldwide populations. The results were remarkable. Bene Israel genomes looked strongly like surrounding Indian populations, which demonstrated that their ancestors had become deeply integrated into the Indian genetic landscape. But they also formed a distinctive genetic population, and unlike ordinary Indian populations in the study, showed considerable genetic sharing with other Jewish populations. In other words, the Bene Israel were neither simply an Indian population practicing Judaism, nor a genetically unchanged Middle Eastern Jewish population transplanted to India. Their genomes showed substantial ancestry from both sides. Researchers described them as an admixed population with both Jewish and Indian ancestry, followed by a population bottleneck and strong endogamy. This was one of the strongest genetic confirmations that the Bene Israel community preserved a real ancestral connection to the Jewish diaspora, while also becoming substantially Indian through centuries of interaction and reproduction. But the most interesting part came when scientists tried to determine when that mixing happened. They used a statistical method that examines the structure of DNA segments created when two populations interbreed. When populations first mix, their chromosomes contain long blocks inherited from each ancestry. Over generations, recombination breaks those blocks into progressively smaller pieces. By measuring the distribution of these segments, researchers can estimate approximately how many generations have passed since admixture occurred. For Bene Israel, the study estimated the major Jewish-Indian admixture at roughly 19 to 33 generations ago, corresponding to approximately 650 to 1,050 years under the study's assumptions. The researchers emphasized that the admixture was sex-biased, with a stronger male Jewish contribution and a stronger local Indian female contribution. This does not prove the exact circumstances of individual relationships, but it does establish an important population-level pattern. A major portion of the Jewish ancestry detectable in modern Bene Israel appears to have entered through a relatively recent period of interaction rather than representing one completely isolated migration thousands of years ago. And that creates an important distinction. The genetic dating does not prove that Jewish people could not have reached India earlier. It only tells us when the most detectable major admixture event occurred. An earlier small founder population could have arrived and then become heavily diluted before later Jewish migrants contributed additional ancestry. In other words, DNA can detect the strongest surviving signal, but it cannot guarantee that every earlier migration left a recognizable genetic trace. This is why the Bene Israel results are fascinating rather than simplistic. The community may preserve an ancient memory of arrival, while the genome records the later period when Jewish and Indian ancestry mixed most strongly. Scientists also had to solve a difficult problem before accepting this conclusion. Indian populations already carry ancestry related to populations from Western Eurasia, including ancient groups connected to the Iranian plateau and neighboring regions. Jewish populations also contain substantial ancestry connected to the Middle East. So how could researchers prove that the Jewish signal in Bene Israel was genuinely Jewish rather than just ordinary West Eurasian ancestry already present in India? The solution was comparison. Researchers did not compare Bene Israel only with one Jewish population. They analyzed hundreds of individuals from multiple Jewish communities, dozens of Indian and Pakistani groups, and additional world populations. They used several independent methods, including principal component analysis, genetic distance, ancestry modeling, identity by descent sharing, haplotype analysis, and admixture dating. The important result was that Bene Israel repeatedly showed relationships with Jewish populations that could not be explained simply by the older ancestry found across many Indians. The genetic pattern was distinctive. It pointed toward a specific interaction between Indian and Jewish populations. This is one of the most important reasons the findings became persuasive. If researchers had found only vague similarity between Bene Israel and Jews, the result could easily have been explained by shared ancient West Eurasian ancestry. Instead, the data showed a pattern consistent with a genuine Jewish contribution, followed by local admixture. The genome therefore provided something written records could not provide, evidence that the Bene Israel ancestral story contained a measurable biological connection to other Jewish populations. At the same time, the analysis showed just how thoroughly local ancestry became incorporated. The modern Bene Israel community is genetically Indian as well as Jewish. Neither half can honestly be removed from the story. Then scientists looked south toward Kerala, and the answer became even more surprising. The Cochin Jews of the Malabar coast have one of the oldest and most fascinating Jewish traditions in India. Community legends have connected their arrival to biblical times, sometimes to the era of King Solomon, while other traditions associate them with the destruction of the first or second temple, or later Jewish migrations. But historical documentation becomes much firmer only during the medieval period. Researchers therefore wanted to know what the genetic record could say. They collected genome-wide data from Cochin Jews and compared them with hundreds of Indian, Jewish, Pakistani, Middle Eastern, and worldwide populations. The results showed that Cochin Jews were genetically close to local Indian populations, confirming a strong Indian component. But they also possessed substantial Jewish genetic ancestry that was not found in ordinary neighboring Indian populations. Even more interesting, the researchers detected significant recent Jewish gene flow approximately 13 to 22 generations ago, equivalent to roughly 470 to 730 years under their model. The Jewish ancestry appeared compatible with contributions from Yemenite, Sephardi, and other Middle Eastern Jewish populations. This was a major discovery because it indicated that Cochin Jewish history involved more than a single founding event. There may have been an earlier Jewish presence in Kerala, but a later and genetically detectable movement from other Jewish communities appears to have added significant ancestry to the population. The genome was therefore revealing layers of history rather than one beginning, and this is where the Indian Ocean becomes central to the story. Modern maps make India and the Middle East look separated by an enormous body of water, but for ancient and medieval merchants, the Arabian Sea was not simply an obstacle. It was a transportation network. Ports on the western coast of India were connected to Arabia, Yemen, Persia, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Ships carried spices, textiles, metals, pearls, precious stones, and other high-value products. Jewish merchants participated in these commercial networks, and Jewish communities developed in important trading centers. This provides a historical context for the genetic findings. A small number of Jewish migrants did not need an enormous army or a mass migration to establish a community. A few merchants, families, or religious travelers could settle permanently, marry locally, establish community institutions, and produce descendants. Later, Jewish migrants could then join them. The process could continue over generations. The Cochin Jewish genome appears compatible with exactly this kind of layered maritime history. The detected Jewish ancestry is not a mysterious signal floating in isolation. It fits the historical reality of a coastline connected to Jewish communities across the Middle East. Yemen is especially important because it sits directly along the western Indian Ocean routes. If Yemenite-related Jewish ancestry appears in Kerala, the geography makes historical sense. The genetic result, therefore, connects molecular evidence with the known maritime world. The Indian Ocean was not merely a road for goods, it was a road for people, families, cultures, religions, and genes. The comparison between Bene Israel and Cochin Jews therefore creates one of the most important conclusions in the entire story. Indian Jewish communities did not necessarily descend from one original founder population. Their genetic histories are different. Bene Israel shows a substantial mixture of Indian and Jewish ancestry, with a major admixture event estimated within the last millennium. Cochin Jews also possess mixed Indian and Jewish ancestry, but the detectable Jewish gene flow appears somewhat later and includes relationships to several Jewish populations. This means the idea of a single Jewish migration to India is almost certainly too simple. Instead, India appears to have received different Jewish migrants at different times and through different routes. Some arrived through maritime trade, some may have settled permanently. Others probably joined communities that already existed. Some local Indians may have entered Jewish communities through conversion or marriage. Over time, endogamy preserved the resulting populations. This process created communities that were culturally Jewish but genetically shaped by India. It also explains why Indian Jewish populations today do not all look genetically alike. Their differences are not evidence against a Jewish connection. They are evidence that different communities experienced different histories. The role of Indian ancestry is especially important because it demonstrates how deeply these communities became part of the societies around them. Bene Israel genomes resemble local Western Indian populations. Cochin Jewish genomes resemble local Kerala populations. This is exactly what we would expect after centuries of life in India. People did not simply arrive and remain biologically isolated. They married local partners, had children, and became part of Indian society. Some Jewish ancestry was preserved through community endogamy, while local Indian ancestry entered the population. The result was a new genetic combination. This is a common pattern throughout human history. A migrant population arrives in a new region, mixes with local people, and later becomes more endogamous. Centuries afterward, geneticists discover both components in their descendants. What makes Indian Jews special is that the process happened across religious and geographic boundaries while still preserving a recognizable Jewish cultural identity. Genetics therefore demonstrates that Jewish identity in India was never simply a matter of preserving Middle Eastern ancestry. It was also a story of adaptation. Communities learned local languages, they adopted local foods and customs, they developed their own regional Jewish traditions, and their DNA changed accordingly. The genome is therefore telling us something broader than where the first ancestors came from. It is showing how an immigrant community becomes part of a new homeland without completely losing the identity that brought it there. Endogamy then became the force that preserved these communities as distinct populations. Once Indian Jewish communities formed, many marriages occurred within the community. Over generations, this reduced the constant flow of new ancestry from surrounding populations. It also created founder effects. When a community begins with a relatively small number of people, rare genetic variants carried by those founders can become more common among their descendants. If the population then grows while remaining endogamous, the founder's genetic signature can become surprisingly visible hundreds of years later. Researchers studying both Bene Israel and Cochin Jews found evidence of population bottlenecks and high endogamy. This helps explain why their genomes can be distinctive despite their substantial Indian ancestry. Endogamy acts like a biological archive. It does not freeze ancestry completely, but it slows the dilution of genetic relationships between community members. It can preserve segments of DNA that might otherwise disappear into the larger surrounding population. The same process can also increase the frequency of recessive genetic disorders, which is why researchers pay careful medical attention to isolated populations. But the broader historical consequence is fascinating. A small group of migrants can leave a detectable genetic footprint long after their arrival. especially if their descendants form a relatively closed community. That appears to have happened repeatedly in Indian Jewish history. The paternal and maternal evidence adds another layer. Studies of Indian Jewish populations have found largely South Asian maternal lineages in many samples, alongside Middle Eastern and Jewish-associated paternal lineages. This pattern can occur when migrant men settle in a new region and have families with local women. Over generations, the children inherit Indian mitochondrial DNA through their mothers, while retaining Jewish-associated ancestry through paternal and autosomal lines. Such sex-biased ancestry does not prove the circumstances of every family, but at the population level, it can reveal the direction in which gene flow occurred. The Bene Israel study specifically found evidence of more male Jewish and local female contribution. That is a remarkable result because it gives the DNA a demographic direction. The genome is not simply saying these populations mixed, it is providing clues about how the mixture happened. Men may have been more likely to travel as merchants or migrants, while local women became part of the new communities. Later generations then became endogamous and preserved the resulting genetic mixture. This pattern has appeared in many diaspora populations around the world. Human migration has often been sex-biased, and genetics can sometimes reconstruct that hidden history. The Baghdadi Jews provide an important contrast because their migration into India is historically much more recent. Jewish merchants from Iraq, Syria, Iran, and surrounding Middle Eastern regions established communities in Indian cities during the 18th and 19th centuries. Bombay, Calcutta, and other commercial centers became home to these newer Jewish populations. Unlike Bene Israel and Cochin Jews, whose origins are surrounded by much older traditions and uncertain early records, Baghdadi Jewish migration is relatively well documented. Their presence demonstrates that Indian Jewish history continued long after the supposed ancient arrival period. Jewish migration into India was not one event. It was an ongoing process. Ancient or medieval communities could be joined by later migrants from other Jewish populations. This means a modern Indian Jewish genome may contain ancestry from several historical waves. A person could carry ancestry from an older community that developed in India centuries earlier, and additional ancestry introduced by later Jewish migration. The genome, therefore, contains layers, much like an archaeological site. Each layer corresponds to a different episode of human movement. This is why scientists resist reducing an entire community to one ancestry percentage. The percentage tells you what is present. Population history tells you how it got there. Another major discovery came when researchers compared Indian Jewish populations not just with European Jews, but with Jewish communities throughout the world. This helped reveal that the Jewish ancestry in India was not simply a generic Middle Eastern signal. Bene Israel showed sharing with broader Jewish populations. Cochin Jews showed evidence of contributions from Yemenite, Sephardi, and Middle Eastern Jewish sources. These connections were especially interesting because they matched plausible historical roots. Yemen lies along the Indian Ocean trade system. Sephardi communities spread across the Mediterranean and Ottoman world after the expulsions from Iberia. Jewish merchants moved across these networks. A genetic contribution from such populations is therefore not mysterious. It is exactly what historians would expect if Jewish communities in India maintained connections with the wider Jewish commercial world. The DNA effectively confirms that the Indian Jewish diaspora was not completely isolated from other Jewish communities. People in Ancestry continued to move between Jewish populations even after communities became geographically distant. That ongoing movement probably helped preserve a broader sense of Jewish connection while allowing each Indian community to develop local customs. The Cochin Jewish study is especially interesting because the researchers tested many combinations of potential Indian and Jewish ancestral populations. Several Jewish populations could statistically serve as proxies for the Jewish component, while different Indian populations could serve as proxies for the Indian component. This tells us something important about population modeling. Scientists often cannot identify the exact individuals who contributed ancestry to a present-day population. Instead, they compare modern populations that are genetically similar to the ancient source and ask which combination best explains the target genome. That means when a study says Yemenite Jews contributed ancestry, it may mean that the genome is most compatible with that population acting as a proxy for the source. It does not necessarily mean that a specific group of Yemenite Jews arrived in Kerala on a known date. Science works through probability and comparison. This distinction is important for understanding what genetics can and cannot reveal. The DNA is powerful, but it does not come with labels attached. Researchers reconstruct the past from patterns. This is also why the traditional stories of Indian Jews remain interesting even when genetic dates appear later. A community can preserve a story about an ancient ancestor, while later migrations contribute much of the ancestry visible in modern DNA. Imagine a small population arrives long ago, remains isolated for centuries, then receives a second wave of migrants. If the second wave is genetically larger, the modern genome may look primarily like the second event, even though the community's first arrival was genuinely ancient. Conversely, an ancient founding event can become almost invisible through repeated local admixture. Therefore, the absence of a strong ancient genetic signal does not prove an ancient tradition false. It means the genetic evidence is insufficient to confirm that specific claim. Researchers must therefore combine DNA with archaeology, inscriptions, trade records, religious texts, oral histories, and historical documents. Indian Jewish history is exactly the kind of problem where no single source can solve the mystery. One of the most important things scientists did not find is just as revealing. They did not find evidence that Indian Jews are simply identical to a surrounding Indian population that later adopted Judaism across the board. Nor did they find that Indian Jewish communities are simply transplanted Middle Eastern populations with almost no local ancestry. Instead, both components are substantial in the communities studied. Bene Israel, in particular, are genetically closer to surrounding Indian populations while maintaining a distinctive Jewish ancestry component. Cochin Jews are also genetically embedded within the Indian landscape, but retain a measurable Jewish component absent from ordinary neighboring Indian groups. This middle position is the key. The truth was not located at either extreme. The communities were created through interaction. That is why their DNA looks mixed. Their ancestry is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of history. And perhaps this is the most powerful part of the story. Indian Jews became genetically Indian without ceasing to be Jewish. Their communities demonstrate that identity can survive through mechanisms other than biological isolation. Religion can survive. Cultural memory can survive. Community institutions can survive. Family traditions can survive. At the same time, ancestry can change. Indian Jewish history therefore provides a powerful example of the difference between cultural continuity and genetic continuity. They overlap, but they are not identical. A person can inherit mostly Indian ancestry while belonging to a Jewish community whose traditions began elsewhere. Another person can inherit a stronger Middle Eastern genetic component but live culturally within India. DNA tells one part of the story. Identity tells another. Modern research is also changing the way scientists think about the wider Jewish diaspora. Large studies of Jewish populations across the world have shown that most major diaspora communities share substantial genetic relationships with one another and with populations connected to the Middle East, while also showing regional admixture. Indian Jews are an especially interesting exception because their genomes are heavily shaped by their surrounding populations. This does not separate them from Jewish history. Instead, it demonstrates how differently Jewish communities evolved after leaving the ancient Near East. Some remained genetically close to the host populations but preserved the Jewish cultural traditions. Others remained more genetically distinct because of stronger endogamy. Some mixed repeatedly. Others received later migration. The diaspora was therefore not one uniform experience. It was thousands of local histories connected by religion, ancestry, trade, and memory. This also means the phrase Indian Jews came from Israel is too simple to be scientifically useful. Ancient Jewish populations were themselves part of a broader Near Eastern genetic landscape. Modern Jewish communities also carry varying amounts of European, North African, Middle Eastern, and other ancestry. So the genetic source of an Indian Jewish community cannot be reduced to a modern national category. Scientists are looking for ancestral populations, not today's countries. When studies identify Middle Eastern Jewish ancestry, they are pointing toward genetic relationships with Jewish populations from regions such as Yemen, Iraq, Iran, the Levant, or Mediterranean communities. The actual migration route may have involved several intermediate locations. A person who eventually settled in Kerala might have had ancestors who lived in Yemen generations earlier. Another might have passed through the Persian Gulf. Another could have come from a Jewish community connected to the Mediterranean. The genome can reveal ancestry, but archaeology and history are needed to reconstruct the route. The Indian Ocean made these routes possible. Monsoon winds created predictable seasonal patterns that experienced sailors could exploit. Coastal navigation connected ports across Arabia and India. Jewish merchants were part of broader commercial networks that moved between the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, Persian Gulf, Western India, and Kerala. Trade created communities because merchants needed places to live, worship, conduct contracts, and raise families. Over time, those temporary settlements could become permanent. A tiny foreign community could transform into a distinct local population. That may be exactly what happened repeatedly in India. Instead of imagining a huge invasion or mass migration, imagine a handful of ships arriving over generations. A few merchants settled. Some marry local women. Their children grow up speaking Indian languages. More relatives arrive. A synagogue is built. A community becomes established. Eventually, everyone forgets exactly which ship carried the first ancestor, but the DNA remains, and that is what makes the Indian Jewish mystery so compelling. The written record becomes silent exactly where the genome begins speaking. Traditional stories preserve identity but often lack precise dates. Historical documents preserve later communities but rarely explain their earliest origins. Archaeology reveals settlements and artifacts but cannot always identify who lived there. Genetics connects the pieces. It cannot tell us everything, but it can show ancestry, admixture, migration timing, and population structure. When all those clues are combined, a broad picture emerges. Indian Jews were not created through one event. Jewish migrants reached India through different routes and periods. They interacted with local Indian populations. Their descendants retained Jewish cultural traditions. Endogamy preserved distinctive genetic patterns. Later migrations contributed additional ancestry. And the result is several Indian Jewish communities with different genetic histories. The strongest conclusion is therefore surprisingly simple. Indian Jews came from both worlds. Their Jewish ancestors came through migration from the broader Middle Eastern Jewish world. Their Indian ancestry came through local populations. Their communities were formed through interaction. Their identities survived through culture and community. Their DNA preserved the mixture, and time turned that mixture into something unique. The Bene Israel are not genetically identical to Middle Eastern Jews. The Cochin Jews are not genetically identical to Bene Israel. The Baghdadi Jews represent a later chapter. But all of these communities are part of the broader Indian Jewish story, and the genetic evidence shows that this story is real. Not because DNA proves every legend, not because every traditional date is confirmed, but because the genome independently records Jewish ancestry within populations that also carry substantial Indian ancestry. That is the breakthrough. Scientists did not simply find Jewish DNA in India. They reconstructed the demographic process that put it there: migration, admixture, endogamy, founder effects, repeated contact, and survival. This is why the mystery lasted for centuries. The truth was never a single answer waiting in one ancient document. It was spread across generations, communities, ships, marriages, and chromosomes. The DNA finally allowed researchers to see the pattern, and perhaps the most surprising result is that the story is not really about people leaving one homeland and recreating it somewhere else. It is about people becoming part of a new homeland without completely losing the ancestry and traditions that connected them to the old one. That is what happened in India. The communities changed, the languages changed, the customs changed, the ancestry changed, but the identity survived. And now the genome gives scientists a way to watch that transformation backward through time. The final mystery is no longer simply where Indian Jews came from. It is how a small number of migrants moving across an ancient ocean could leave such a durable genetic and cultural footprint. The answer is written in the chromosomes. People moved, people met, people married, people built communities, people remembered. And hundreds of years later, their descendants are still carrying the evidence. The Indian Jewish DNA mystery was never a story about one origin. It was a story about many journeys becoming one history.